We're going to look today at how the body sends signals and messages through the neurons, and this is a process known as neural transmission. So how signals are sent throughout the nervous system, essentially, is the key focus of today's lecture. So first we need to kind of tackle the concept of neurons. So neurons are individual cells that, if they end up getting bundled together, these are what make what we call nerves, and that is parts of the body that react to sensations and pressure and things of that sort. So they're individual cells that bundle together to create our nervous system. And these individual cells look a little bit different than normal cells, but they do have what's known as the soma right in this area, which is kind of a clearly defined nucleated body. So this is the nucleus, this is the body of the cell, and that is known as the soma in a neuron. And then branching from the soma are what are called dendrites, and these are these branches right here. And these dendrites are essentially receptor areas. They are taking in information from other neurons. And so they branch out from the soma and receive information from other neurons. And if this neuron wants to send a message to other neurons, it does it through what's called the axon. And this is this long tube-like structure that gets input from the dendrites in the soma and continues on down this way. Okay, so that's kind of the basic structure of the neuron. So you have the soma as the body of the cell, the dendrites, which are the receptor areas, and then this axon right here that is kind of the long arm that sends out information. And axons are often covered in a fatty coating called a myelin sheath, and so that is this kind of lighter yellow area right here. This is known as the myelin sheath. And it's important to notice that you have this on this axon. The myelin sheath is not the whole way down. It almost looks like a necklace that has like kind of gaps in between, right? So beads on a necklace or a bracelet or something. So there's kind of some room there. And so that myelin sheath is important because it helps to make neural transmission go faster. It makes things go faster along the axon, and so speeding up the rate of travel is important, and the more insulated it is, the faster it goes. So that fatty protection is important. But there are those gaps you saw in that, and those are known as the nodes of Ranvier, and those actually help speed up neural transmission as well. And that's because neural transmission is an electrical process essentially, and so by having these kind of alternating currents, it makes it go a little bit quicker through there. So the whole purpose of the myelin sheath is to speed up the process by which neural transmissions are sent. And at the end of the axon, we have these little areas over here, and these look similar to the dendrites, but they're called terminal buttons. Okay, so those areas at the end, you have, again, soma, dendrites, the axon with the covered in the myelin sheath, and these are the nodes of Ranvier, and then the axon ends in what's known as the terminal buttons. And those terminal buttons are knobs that branch out at the end, and those are what comes really close to touching the dendrites of other neurons, and it is through those that chemical messages are passed, right? And so that little tiny area between a terminal button and a dendrite is known as a synapse. And the synapses are important in this neural transmission process. So again, these terminal buttons would come really close. If we were looking at actual things, you would see a dendrite would be right near the other side, right there, or even sometimes the soma, the actual cell body, would be real close, and the terminal buttons would be almost touching them in that synapse. And the synapses are important because it is this small gap between the dendrites and the terminal buttons, and terminal buttons release what are known as neurotransmitters, and those are chemical messengers that cross the synapse and binds with receptors on the other side, on the dendrites. And those neurotransmitters then tell that neuron what to do, and what sensation should be feeling and what reaction should be happening. And so these different chemical messages are really important. And so some of the neurotransmitters that our body has, and you can see them here, acetylcholine, that affects memory and muscle contractions. And so as scientists kind of are learning more about these things, they're able to figure out what's causing certain diseases or certain problems, as if those neurotransmitters aren't firing or firing too much. And so acetylcholine is important, especially in the heart. Serotonin is important in how it affects arousal, sleep, pain, mood, and hunger. So that is kind of dealing with kind of the emotions of the body. Dopamine deals with movement, attention, and reward. And so that is kind of that feeling good, positive reward. And there's the kind of a sense that if you have an imbalance in dopamine, that may play a role in Parkinson's and schizophrenia. So again, we're starting to see, it's still early on, but we're starting to gain a better understanding of the role that these neurotransmitters play in not just sending messages, but affecting the whole brain. So we've got that going on. And then you have GABA, which is gamma-aminobutyric acid, and that acts as an inhibitory neurotransmitter. So we'll talk more about what inhibitory is, but it essentially stops the neuron from firing. And then glutamate, which is an excitatory neurotransmitter, which is counterpart to GABA. So they kind of coexist in separate spheres. Then you have two other ones, norepinephrine, which affects the level of alertness, how awake you are. There's a thought that a lack of this could be one of the causes of depression. And then endorphins exist as well. Those are kind of the body's natural painkillers. So there are two ways in which, like, we're going to look at kind of two types of neural communication. Within cells, so from the dendrite to the soma, down the axon, and to the terminal buttons. And then between cells, so from terminal button to dendrite. So those are the two types. So first we'll look at neuronal communication within cells. And it's really important to know that this is an electrochemical reaction that occurs in these cells. And it's, I mean, for how small neurons are and for how, for how small they are, it's an incredibly complex process. So essentially there is in neurons, there's an electric potential that exists. And this is known as resting membrane potential. It exists because the interior of the cell is negatively charged with respect to the exterior. So that occurs because of kind of the exchange of two important ions, and that is sodium and potassium are the two kind of chemicals that we're dealing with here. And sodium is pumped out of the cell while potassium is pumped into the cell. And there's kind of there's ATPase pumps that allow that to happen, and then there's something called leak channels that allow potassium to come in. And so this leads to an imbalance. The cells are polarized, where they are more negative on the inside and they are positive on the outside. And so that it ends up being, like, I guess they figured out the average electric potential. The average electrical resting potential is negative 70 millivolts that exists. That is the amount of polarization that occurs. And so that's the kind of cell's resting state, the neuron's resting state. And occasionally you get what is known as an action potential, or sometimes called a nerve impulse. And that is a disturbance in the membrane. And think of it, this is essentially your neurons firing, right? It receives a transmission and it shoots it down from the dendrites down the axon out to the terminal buttons. And this is known, it's a wave of depolarization. So it changes the membrane potential to a less negative, from negative 70 to say negative 20, or even a positive potential. So it's shooting the potassium ions out, essentially, is the way to look at it, to change the balance of the negative versus positive energy that exists. And so this action potential happens. The membrane goes to a positive potential by shooting ions out of neuron and through these ion channels that exist. And so that sends the impulse from the dendrites through the soma, through the axon to the terminal buttons, and then out the cell. And so this leaves the neuron then in a positive or less negative resting potential, which is a problem. And so repolarization is the term, is when the membrane returns back to normal. And so that again is this potassium coming in while sodium is going out to lead us back to negative 70 millivolts as our resting membrane potential. And it's worth noting that these action potentials are what they call all or none events. So either the whole thing fires or it doesn't fire at all. There's no like, it halfway fired or it only fired at 50%. No, like it fires or it doesn't. The neuron reacts or it does not. And so following an action potential or this nerve impulse, there's something called an absolute refractory period where the neuron absolutely cannot fire again because it's positively charged or not negatively charged enough to react. Then there's what's known as a relative refractory period where the neuron needs more stimulation in order to fire. So it would need to receive more of the neurotransmitters in order to fire again, versus if it was at its full resting membrane potential. So again, when you have to kind of break this down to its, so try and be as simple as possible. You have a neuron that's just kind of in a resting state. It's at negative 70 millivolts. The dendrites receive some neurotransmitter information and the nerve impulse fires, which sends potassium out of the cell, changing its polarization from negative to positive. And that process is sending an electrical signal down the nerve to the terminal buttons, which then releases neurotransmitters. So now our neuron is sitting at a positive polarization and needs to return to its negative polarization in order to be ready to fire another message. And so in order to do that, sodium is pumped out of the cell and potassium is leaked back into the cell during what's known as the refractory period, and that gets us back to our resting membrane potential of negative 70 millivolts. So all of that happens within the cell at just an unbelievable speed. It's not like this stuff takes a long time. This stuff happens incredibly fast. We're talking in milliseconds here. So that's how important and quick of a process it is, even though it's supremely complex. And then we need to see the communication between cells. So when that kind of nerve impulse reaches the end of the cell and hits the terminal button, what happens then? And it is the release of neurotransmitters that we talked about before. And those neurotransmitters cross the synapse and then they attach to the dendrites on the other side. And so there are two types of neurotransmitters, excitatory neurotransmitters, and those create the nerve impulses. That creates the neuron firing. It excites the cell. And then there are inhibitory neurotransmitters, which stop the cell from firing. So those are kind of the two different things we would look at. Okay, and again, GABA is kind of the main inhibitory neurotransmitters, and the rest of them that we looked at: serotonin, acetylcholine, dopamine, glutamate, norepinephrine, and endorphins are kind of all excitatory neurotransmitters. And after the neuron is released, it crosses the synapse. It activates it leaves the terminal buttons, crosses the synapse, and kind of latches onto receptor sites on the dendrites, and passes that chemical information along. After that, there are two things that can happen to it. It can either be broken down by enzymes in that synapse, or it can be absorbed back into the cell that released it, so it goes back across the synapse to the terminal buttons and is reabsorbed in a process called reuptake. And so that's how the body kind of maintains its balance of these chemicals. And obviously it's a real delicate balance, although there are billions of neurons, but it still tends to be a delicate balance. And so these two processes are really important to keeping that. So that's kind of the main overview of how these neurons work, how information is passed through and across these neurons to create these nerve stimulus and these nerve firing.